This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. In the heart of Oklahoma, there was a place called Miller's Hollow, a small, sun-beaten town nestled between endless plains of wheat and wind-worn hills. It wasn't on most maps, and that's how the people of Miller's Hollow liked it. Theirs was a town where secrets could be hidden behind wooden fences, where smiles at Sunday service masked whispered judgment. The air was thick with the smell of dry earth and diesel from passing tractors, and the silence of the vast land was broken only by the wind. For outsiders, it was a picture of small-town America, quaint, self-sufficient, and serene. But to those who lived there, Miller's Hollow was a pressure cooker, its peace a fragile facade that concealed unspoken tensions and long-simmering feuds. Beneath the surface, there were wounds that never healed and shadows that lingered, even under the bright Oklahoma sun. Abigail Prescott, or Abby as she was known, lived on the edge of town in a dilapidated farmhouse that looked like it might collapse with the next strong gust of wind. The Prescott house was a relic of a better time, once painted white but now faded to a splotchy gray, its roof patched with rusted tin. Inside, the air smelled of mildew and dust, and the walls were thin enough to hear every creak of the floorboards. Abby's world was small and grim, much like the house she lived in. At 13, she was small for her age, her thin frame a testament to the meals she often skipped. Her pale face was dominated by large, unblinking blue eyes that seemed to take in everything, even the things people wished to hide. The town whispered about Abby and her family. Her father, Roy Prescott, was a mean drunk with a temper like a coiled snake. He spent his days fixing machinery for local farmers and his nights drowning himself in cheap whiskey. When he wasn't drinking, he was yelling at Abby, at her mother, before she vanished years ago, at anyone who crossed his path. No one in Miller's Hollow knew what had happened to Abby's mother, and most were too afraid to ask. The official story was that she'd packed her bags one night and left, but the bruises she'd often worn on her arms and face hinted at a darker truth. People in the town knew better than to intervene. The Prescotts had always been trouble, and Roy was the kind of man you didn't cross unless you wanted your tires slashed or your barn mysteriously set on fire. Abby's classmates at school didn't understand her. She was quiet, a loner who sat at the back of the classroom, her nose buried in books about true crime and forensic science. Her fascination with death made her an oddity, even in a town where eccentricities were tolerated. Sometimes, the other kids whispered that she was creepy, that there was something wrong with her. They called her names: Freak, Dead Girl, Prescott Psycho. But Abby never reacted. She would just stare at them with those unnervingly calm blue eyes until they looked away. Even the teachers didn't quite know what to make of her. She was a straight-A student, brilliant in subjects like chemistry and biology, but there was a coldness to her, an emotional distance that made them uneasy. She didn't have friends, and she didn't seem to want any. The Prescott property was surrounded by overgrown fields and bordered by a forest that the locals avoided. The woods had a reputation, the kind of place where teenagers dared each other to spend the night, but never actually did. Old-timers told stories of strange sounds in the trees, of people going missing. Abby spent hours wandering those woods, finding solace among the shadows. She would sit by the stagnant creek that ran through the forest, watching the water trickle over rocks, her mind racing with thoughts she didn't dare speak aloud. She collected bones, bird skulls, deer antlers, even the occasional stray cat's remains, and arranged them in patterns in the dirt. To her, they weren't morbid. They were beautiful, pieces of a puzzle that only she could solve. One summer night, the kind of night where the air felt heavy and the cicadas screamed in the trees, something in Miller's Hollow shifted. It started with the fire. Abby's father, drunk as usual, had fallen asleep with a lit cigarette in his hand. The flames consumed the old farmhouse quickly, the dry wood igniting like kindling. By the time the volunteer fire department arrived, the house was little more than charred beams and smoldering ashes. Abby was found outside, sitting on the ground with her knees pulled to her chest, her face smeared with soot, but otherwise unharmed. When asked how she'd escaped, she simply said, "I woke up and ran." The fire was ruled an accident, though some of the townsfolk whispered that it was strange how calm Abby had been, how she didn't shed a single tear for her father. After the fire, Abby moved into a small trailer on the edge of the property, left to fend for herself. The town, out of a mix of pity and guilt, brought her food and supplies, but they kept their distance. There was something unsettling about the girl now. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her words carried a weight far beyond her years. She had a way of looking at people, as though she could see straight through them, down to the darkest corners of their souls. The animals in town began to disappear. First a stray dog, then a farmer's prized rooster, then a litter of kittens. People blamed coyotes, but some couldn't help but notice how Abby's eyes seemed to gleam when they mentioned the missing pets. Miller's Hollow was a town built on routine, and its people were creatures of habit. They woke with the sun, worked their fields, and gathered at the diner or church to gossip. But after the fire, a sense of unease crept into their lives. Locks were checked twice, windows shuttered before nightfall. It was as though the land itself had become restless, the endless plains stretching out like a vast, empty graveyard. And at the center of it all was Abby Prescott, the quiet girl with the pale face and the haunting blue eyes, sitting alone in her trailer, her mind spinning webs of thoughts too dark for anyone to imagine. The peace of Miller's Hollow was no longer a comforting silence. It was the stillness before a storm. Something was coming, something that would shatter the fragile harmony of the town, and at its heart, unseen and unassuming, was a girl who had learned that fire could cleanse and that death could be a kind of freedom. Abby Prescott was waiting, and the people of Miller's Hollow didn't know it yet, but they had every reason to fear her. After the fire that consumed her father and left her standing alone in the charred remains of her childhood, Abby Prescott became the ghost of Miller's Hollow. The town didn't quite know what to do with her. At just 13, she was too young to be on her own, but she had no family willing to take her in. The local church raised enough money to buy her a used trailer and park it on the edge of her family's scorched property, a quiet solution to a problem no one wanted to look in the eye. People delivered casseroles, old clothes, and awkward condolences, but none of it reached Abby in any meaningful way. She accepted their offerings with blank eyes and a tight-lipped smile, and then she vanished back into the trailer, closing the door behind her, as if shutting herself off from the world. In the weeks that followed, the rumors about the fire began to grow. People whispered over coffee at the diner or in hushed conversations after church services. It wasn't just the fact that Abby had survived unscathed that unsettled them. It was the way she had stood there that night, surrounded by flames, her face lit by the inferno. She hadn't screamed or cried, hadn't begged anyone for help. She had simply watched, her pale face smeared with soot, her expression as unreadable as stone. Her hair had been spray-painted yellow by the fire now. He couldn't tell what color her face was, but it had to stick out like a copy in the rest of the house. Some said they'd seen a flicker of something in her eyes as the house collapsed. Something almost like satisfaction. But these were things no one said aloud, at least not directly. The people of Miller's Hollow prided themselves on being good Christians, and good Christians didn't accuse an orphaned girl of setting her own house on fire. Abby, however, heard the whispers. She felt the weight of the town's suspicion every time she walked into the grocery store or sat in the back row of her classroom. The stares of her classmates burned into her back like branding irons, and even the teachers seemed to falter when they looked at her too long. Abby didn't care, or at least she told herself she didn't. The truth was more complicated, a tangled mess of emotions she didn't have the words to express. She felt powerful and invisible all at once, a paradox that began to define her existence, and, in her solitude, her thoughts began to darken, curling inward like smoke trapped in a jar. It was during one of her solitary walks through the woods that the first seed of what would come next was planted. The woods were Abby's sanctuary, a place where she could escape the judgmental eyes of the town and let her mind wander. The trees were thick and ancient, their gnarled branches twisting together to form a canopy that blocked out the sun. It was in those woods that she felt truly free, as though the world beyond the trees didn't exist. One afternoon, as she followed the creek deeper than she'd ever dared before, she stumbled upon something unexpected. A dead deer, its body swollen and rotting, flies buzzing in a thick cloud around it. Abby didn't flinch or turn away. Instead, she crouched down and studied the animal, her eyes tracing the bloated contours of its body, the way its ribs poked through its thin hide. She reached out and touched it, her fingers brushing against the cold, wet fur. Something shifted inside her in that moment. Something she couldn't explain. Death wasn't ugly, she realized. It was quiet and still, and in its stillness it held a kind of power. The deer had once been alive, its heart pounding, its lungs filling with air, but now it was nothing more than flesh and bone, returned to the earth. It wasn't frightening. Abby stayed with the deer until the sun began to set, the shadows of the trees stretching long and dark across the forest floor. When she finally stood to leave, she felt a strange sense of clarity, as though the dead animal had given her a gift, though she couldn't quite say what it was. That night, back in her trailer, Abby lay awake in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling. Her mind replayed the image of the deer, the way its body had seemed to dissolve into the forest around it, becoming part of something larger. Death, she realized, wasn't the end. It was a transformation, a release. Her father's death had been the same. The fire had consumed him, reduced him to ash and embers, and in doing so, it had set her free. She was no longer trapped in his house, no longer subject to his anger or his fists. The fire had been a gift, even if no one else could see it that way. Abby wondered if it could happen again, if death could set others free, just as it had set her free. Her thoughts became darker, more deliberate. She started to notice things she hadn't before. The way people in the town carried their burdens, the weight of their secrets and regrets etched into their faces. There was Mrs. Crenshaw, the bitter widow who yelled at children for playing too close to her garden. There was Mr. Bailey, the grocer, who drank too much and yelled at his wife in the middle of the night. And then there were the kids at school, the ones who whispered about her behind her back or tripped her in the hallway when they thought no one was looking. They were all trapped, she realized, just like her father had been, trapped by their own weaknesses, their own sins. They didn't even see it, but Abby did. She saw it all. One day, while cleaning out the trailer, Abby found an old chemistry set tucked away in a closet. It had belonged to her father, back when he had briefly worked as a handyman for an oil company. Most of the pieces were missing, but there were enough vials and powders left for Abby to start experimenting. She spent hours in the woods, mixing chemicals and testing their effects on the plants and insects she found. She kept her experiments hidden, burying the evidence in shallow graves beneath the trees. Her knowledge of poisons grew quickly, fueled by the books she borrowed from the library and the information she scavenged online. She was careful, meticulous, never leaving a trace. It wasn't long before she had her first opportunity to test her work. The church was hosting a potluck dinner, and the whole town was invited. Abby brought a casserole, a bland-looking dish she'd thrown together with ingredients scavenged from her food donations. Hidden beneath the surface of the dish was a small dose of her latest creation, just enough to make people sick, to see if it would work. And it did. By the end of the night, half the town was doubled over with stomach cramps, some even vomiting in the parking lot. No one suspected Abby. They praised her for contributing to the potluck, for being so brave in the face of her recent tragedy. She smiled politely, hiding the thrill that raced through her veins. The incident was the spark that ignited a fire within her. For the first time in her life, Abby felt in control. She had the power to shape the world around her, to correct the flaws she saw in it. The town of Miller's Hollow didn't know it yet, but a storm was coming. A storm that would sweep through their quiet lives and leave nothing but ashes in its wake. Abby Prescott had found her purpose, and she wasn't afraid to use it. Astronomous, relentlessly. Death, after all, wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The first murder wasn't really a murder, at least not in Abby's mind. It was an experiment, a carefully planned test that came together with the precision of clockwork. By the time she decided to act, she had already mapped it out in her head 100 times. She chose her target with care, Mrs. Crenshaw, the sharp-tongued widow who lived alone in a small house with her prize-winning rose garden. Mrs. Crenshaw was supposedly too rose-pride for Mr. Crenshaw was known for her nasty temper, her cutting remarks about the younger generation, and her tendency to snoop into everyone's business. Abby had overheard her talking about the Prescotts once, years ago, in the grocery store aisle, her voice dripping with disdain as she told a friend that Abby's mother had been no better than trash. The memory stuck to Abby like a burr, burrowing deeper every time she thought of it. Mrs. Crenshaw was perfect. She was old, frail, and mean. A fixture in the town that no one would really miss. Abby knew the woman's routines well. She had spent weeks watching her from the safety of the woods, her small figure hidden by the underbrush as she took careful notes in a battered notebook. Mrs. Crenshaw always tended her roses in the early morning, before the heat of the Oklahoma sun became unbearable. She liked to drink tea on her front porch afterward, sitting in a creaking wicker chair, with a yellowing paperback novel in her lap. Abby waited for a day when the woman's roses were in full bloom, their petals a deep, almost bloody red. It felt poetic, in a way. She crept into the garden under cover of darkness, careful not to disturb the gravel paths that wound between the bushes. From her pocket, she pulled a vial of clear liquid. Something she had brewed from a combination of nightshade berries, which she had foraged in the woods, and a chemical compound scavenged from her father's abandoned tools. It was deadly in small doses, undetectable once absorbed into the body. She dripped the liquid into the woman's watering can and slipped away, the faint smell of roses clinging to her clothes. The next morning, Mrs. Crenshaw watered her garden as usual, humming to herself as she worked. By noon, she was dead, slumped over in her wicker chair with her book lying open on her lap. The coroner ruled it a heart attack. After all, she was old, and her health had been declining for years. No one questioned it. The town mourned her briefly, but there was no real grief. Just the polite sadness people expressed when someone they barely knew passed away. Abby attended the funeral, standing in the back of the church in her only black dress, her face a perfect mask of solemnity. She even brought flowers, a bundle of wild daisies she had picked herself. No one noticed the faint smile that tugged at the corners of her lips as the coffin was lowered into the ground. The success of her first experiment filled Abby with a dangerous sense of confidence. She realized how easy it was to take a life, to make it look like nothing more than an unfortunate accident. The world was full of opportunities, full of people who had no idea how fragile they truly were. Abby began to see the town differently, as though a veil had been lifted. She noticed the small cracks in people's lives, the little habits and vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Mr. Bailey, the grocer, had a bad habit of leaving his truck idling while he ran deliveries. Pastor Moore's wife took long walks alone in the evenings, disappearing into the woods for hours at a time. The Jenkins family always left their back door unlocked, trusting that nothing bad could happen in a place like Miller's Hollow. Abby cataloged these details with the meticulous care of a scientist recording data. Her next target came quickly: Mr. Bailey, the grocer. He had been one of the first to openly pity her after the fire, his sad eyes following her every time she entered his store. At first, she had thought his concern was genuine, but then she overheard him talking to another customer, saying how tragic it was that a girl like her was destined to end up just like her father. His pity was condescending, hollow, and it made her stomach churn with rage. She decided to teach him a lesson. One rainy afternoon, she followed him to the edge of town, where he often parked his truck to deliver groceries to an elderly couple. The road was muddy and slick, the kind of treacherous path that became a death trap in bad weather. Abby waited until he was inside the house, then crept up to his truck and cut the brake lines with a pair of wire cutters she had stolen from her father's old toolbox. When he returned to his truck, the rain had turned into a downpour, and visibility was almost non-existent. He drove off, none the wiser, and didn't realize the brakes were gone until it was too late. The truck careened off the road and into a shallow ravine, flipping twice before coming to a stop. Mr. Bailey didn't survive. The official report blamed the weather and poor road conditions. No one even considered the possibility of foul play. Abby attended his funeral just as she had attended Mrs. Crenshaw's. She cried this time, a small, hiccuping sob that earned her sympathetic glances from the congregation. Inside, she felt nothing but satisfaction. As the months passed, the deaths in Miller's Hollow began to stack up. A young couple died in a house fire after leaving a candle burning too close to the curtains. An elderly man fell down the stairs in his own home, his neck snapping on impact. A teenage boy drowned in the town's swimming hole, his foot mysteriously tangled in an old fishing net that no one had seen before. The town was rattled, but not yet panicked. After all, accidents happened, especially in a place as isolated as Miller's Hollow. Life went on, even as the body count grew. Abby's methods became more elaborate, more creative. She learned to adapt her plans to each victim, tailoring their deaths to fit their lives in ways that would deflect suspicion. She poisoned, she sabotaged, she manipulated. She discovered a love for the planning phase, the careful orchestration of events that would lead to someone's inevitable demise. The power she felt was intoxicating, a heady mix of control and anonymity. No one ever suspected her. To the town, she was still just a quiet, strange girl trying to rebuild her life after a tragedy. But Abby knew the truth. She wasn't rebuilding anything. She was tearing it all down, piece by piece, one life at a time. And with every death, she felt the weight of her own existence grow lighter, as though she were shedding the chains that had bound her for so long. The town didn't know it yet, but it belonged to her now. Miller's Hollow was her canvas, and she was painting it in shades of blood and silence. The unease in Miller's Hollow began as a low murmur, a faint ripple of suspicion that barely disturbed the surface of the town's daily life. But as the deaths accumulated, that ripple grew into a dark undercurrent, pulling the townsfolk deeper into fear. They tried to dismiss it at first, clinging to the notion that the world was still predictable, still safe. Accidents happened, people died, but there was a point when coincidence became impossible to ignore. 20 deaths in less than a year. 20 funerals. 20 names carved into gravestones that had once belonged to a peaceful, sleepy town. The pattern wasn't just disturbing, it was undeniable. Miller's Hollow, it seemed, had become cursed. The whispers grew louder in church pews, at the diner, on the front porches of houses where rocking chairs swayed uneasily in the wind. Some thought it was bad luck, others claimed divine punishment. A few leaned into the old superstitions that had never quite died in this part of the country, blaming restless spirits or witchcraft. But it wasn't until Sheriff Henry Callaway began connecting the dots that the town truly began to understand the scope of what was happening. People thought it was a disaster, and some saw it as a blessing, all in the same valley, a gearbox Cupid. Sheriff Callaway was a man who didn't believe in curses or ghosts. He was a veteran lawman with salt and pepper hair and a reputation for quiet competence. He'd seen his share of tragedy, car accidents, domestic disputes, a handful of drug overdoses, but he'd never dealt with anything like this. He had been at every one of the funerals, standing in the back with his hat in his hands, offering solemn condolences to grieving families. At first, he too had believed it was coincidence, a streak of bad luck that would eventually pass. But as the deaths piled up, he began to see threads that no one else seemed to notice. The timing of the accidents was too precise, the circumstances too unusual, and most importantly, the victims were too connected. He started with Mrs. Crenshaw, the first to die. The heart attack had seemed natural at the time, but Callaway remembered how she had complained about the Prescotts in the months before the fire. Then there was Mr. Bailey, whose truck brakes had failed on a muddy road, a man who had been vocal in his pity for young Abigail Prescott. And the Jenkins family, whose back door had been left unlocked the night of their house fire, a family known for gossiping about Abby's strange behavior. The deeper Callaway looked, the more he realized that the victims shared a common thread. They had all, in some way, crossed paths with the Prescott family. It wasn't much to go on, and it certainly wasn't enough to accuse a 13-year-old girl of orchestrating a killing spree, but it was a starting point. Callaway didn't tell anyone about his suspicions. The town was already teetering on the edge of panic, and he didn't want to add fuel to the fire. Instead, he began his investigation quietly, poring over coroner reports and police files late into the night. He revisited crime scenes, looking for anything that might have been overlooked in the initial chaos. He interviewed neighbors and friends of the victims, piecing together a timeline that stretched back to the night of the Prescott fire. The more he dug, the more questions he unearthed. Why had Abby's father been so drunk the night of the fire? Why had no one else heard the smoke alarm? Why had Abby seemed so calm, so detached, as her house burned to the ground? The investigation began to consume him. He spent less time at home, and when he did, he was distant and distracted. His wife noticed the change in him, the way his hands trembled slightly when he drank his coffee, the dark circles under his eyes that no amount of sleep seemed to erase. He started carrying his gun more often, even when he wasn't on duty. Something about this case made him feel exposed, vulnerable, as though the very ground beneath his feet was shifting. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that someone, something, was always one step ahead of him. Abby, of course, noticed his growing interest. She had seen the way he lingered at the last few funerals, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd as though searching for answers. She had watched him drive past her trailer late at night, his patrol car moving slowly, its headlights slicing through the darkness. At first, she was annoyed. He was a distraction, a loose thread in her otherwise seamless web. But then she realized he was an opportunity. She began leaving small clues, breadcrumbs that would lead him deeper into the maze she had created. An empty vial buried in the woods near the creek, a torn page from one of her notebooks left on a park bench, a handful of nightshade berries crushed into the dirt outside the sheriff's office. He couldn't help but see them. The clues didn't reassure him. They terrified him. Whoever was behind the deaths wasn't just careful, they were meticulous, calculating, and they were taunting him. Callaway started having nightmares, vivid dreams in which he walked through Miller's Hollow at night, only to find the streets deserted and the houses dark. In the dreams, he would follow the sound of laughter, faint and childlike, until he came to the burned-out shell of the Prescott house. There, in the ashes, he would see Abby Prescott, her pale face lit by an unseen fire, her blue eyes boring into him. He would wake up drenched in sweat, his heart pounding in his chest, and the feeling of those eyes would linger, long after he opened his own. He began to suspect Abby, though he couldn't bring himself to say it out loud, not even to his wife. The idea was absurd, impossible. She was just a girl, small and quiet, barely old enough to understand the finality of death. And yet, the pattern was there, undeniable. He started to shadow her, watching from a distance as she walked to school or wandered into the woods. She always seemed to know he was there, her movements calm and unhurried, as though daring him to follow her deeper. The investigation was turning into an obsession, and Callaway knew it. He had lost count of the sleepless nights, the hours spent staring at his wall of notes and photographs, trying to make sense of the chaos. The town was falling apart around him. People were locking their doors during the day, keeping their children close, whispering about leaving Miller's Hollow for good. And all the while, Abby Prescott went about her days as though nothing had changed, her pale face a mask of innocence that Callaway no longer believed. He was closing in on the truth, but the closer he got, the more the darkness seemed to close in around him. Something about this case was different, something beyond his understanding. He could feel it, like a weight pressing down on his chest. It wasn't just a string of murders, it was something deeper, something ancient and unrelenting. And it had taken root in Miller's Hollow. And at the center of it all was a 13-year-old girl, standing in the ruins of her old life, her blue eyes gleaming with a knowledge far beyond her years. Callaway knew he was running out of time, but he didn't know whether he was racing toward the truth or his own destruction. The final confrontation between Sheriff Henry Callaway and Abigail Prescott was destined to happen. It had been building for months, a slow, relentless tightening of a noose that neither of them could escape. Callaway could feel it in the pit of his stomach, a dull ache that warned him something terrible was coming. It wasn't just his own obsession that had led him here. She had been leading him all along, a spider pulling him deeper into her web with every carefully placed clue, every mocking hint that she knew he was chasing her. And now, after all this time, he was ready to confront her. Or so. It was a cold night in late autumn when the end began. The wind tore through Miller's Hollow, scattering dead leaves across the streets and howling through the eaves of old houses. The town was unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that prickled at the edges of Callaway's nerves. He had spent the day reviewing his notes, trying to make sense of the chaos. Abby Prescott was the killer. There was no other explanation. The deaths, the patterns, the eerie precision with which each accident had occurred, it all led back to her. And yet, he had no solid proof, nothing he could take to a court of law. What he did have, however, was a gut feeling, a primal certainty that she was behind it all. He didn't tell anyone where he was going that night. He didn't want backup. This was something he needed to do alone, away from the prying eyes of the town and the whispers of doubt that had plagued him for so long. He drove his patrol car out to the edge of town, to the charred remains of the Prescott house. The property had been abandoned since the fire, left to rot beneath a blanket of weeds and decay. The trailer Abby lived in was still there, a dull metal box sitting in the shadows like a predator waiting to pounce. Callaway parked his car at the edge of the woods and turned off the engine. For a moment, he just sat there, staring at the trailer, his heart pounding in his chest. The wind rocked the car slightly, a rhythmic creaking that seemed to echo his own unsteady breath. He stepped out into the cold, his boots crunching on the gravel driveway. The air smelled of damp earth and distant smoke, a scent that reminded him of the fire that had started all of this. He approached the trailer slowly, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. He didn't want to use it, not on a child, but something told him he might not have a choice. The trailer was dark, its windows reflecting the faint glow of the moon. He reached the door and knocked, the sound echoing hollowly in the silence. No answer. He knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. Finally, he tried the handle. It was unlocked. The door creaked open, revealing the dim, cluttered interior of the trailer. It smelled faintly of mildew and something else. Something metallic and sharp, like blood. Callaway's stomach turned as he stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room. The walls were covered in newspaper clippings, photographs, and hand-drawn diagrams, all connected by a tangle of red string. It was a map of the town, each string leading to a name, a face, a death. At the center of it all was a photograph of Abby, her pale face staring out at him with a faint, unsettling smile. Beneath it, written in bold, uneven letters, were the words, "They had to pay." Callaway's breath caught in his throat. This was it, the proof he had been looking for. But even as relief flooded through him, he felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He wasn't alone. He turned slowly, his hand tightening on his gun. The trailer was small, and it didn't take long for his eyes to find her. Abby stood in the doorway to the back room, her silhouette outlined by the faint glow of a flashlight she held in one hand. Her other hand was hidden behind her back. Her blue eyes were fixed on him, unblinking and cold. There was something different about her now, something that sent a chill down Callaway's spine. She wasn't scared or surprised to see him. She had been expecting him. This was her game, and he had walked straight into it. She stepped forward, the flashlight beam casting long shadows across the walls. The smile on her face was small but deliberate, a flicker of amusement that made Callaway's stomach churn. She tilted her head slightly, as if sizing him up, and then she spoke. Her voice was soft, almost sweet, but there was an edge to it that made his blood run cold. Callaway tried to stay calm, tried to reason with her, but the words caught in his throat. His mind raced as he tried to piece together an escape, but it was too late. Abby raised her hand from behind her back, revealing a small glass jar filled with a dark, viscous liquid. He recognized it immediately. It was the same substance that had been used in the earlier deaths, the poison that had gone undetected in every autopsy. She held it up, letting the light catch the glass, and then she tipped it over, pouring the liquid onto the floor. The smell hit him like a wave, chemical and acrid, a scent that burned his nose and throat. Before he could react, she dropped the flashlight, plunging the trailer into darkness. Callaway fumbled for his own light, but his hands were shaking too badly to hold it steady. He heard her footsteps, quick and light, moving through the shadows. Panic clawed at his chest as he realized he had underestimated her. She wasn't just a child. She was something else entirely. Something far more dangerous than he could have imagined. The next few minutes were a blur of noise and chaos. Callaway stumbled through the trailer, his flashlight flickering as he tried to track her movements. She was fast, impossibly fast, darting in and out of the shadows like a phantom. He called out to her, trying to reason, to beg, but she didn't respond. Instead, she laughed, a high, chilling sound that seemed to echo from every corner of the trailer. It wasn't the laugh of a child. It was something older, darker. Something that had been lurking in the heart of Miller's Hollow for far longer than he had been alive. When he finally found her, crouched in the corner of the room, it was already too late. She moved faster than he expected, lunging at him with a shard of glass in her hand. He fell back, his gun clattering to the floor as she pinned him down. Her face was inches from his, her blue eyes glowing with a manic light. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. In that moment, Callaway understood the truth. Abby Prescott wasn't just a killer. She was the storm that had come to Miller's Hollow, the reckoning for every sin the town had tried to bury. The last thing Callaway saw was her smile, wide and gleaming in the dim light as the glass came down. Then, there was only darkness. When the sheriff didn't show up for work the next morning, the people of Miller's Hollow barely noticed. The town had grown used to his long absences over the last few months, chalking them up to the strain of dealing with the strain of tragic deaths that had plagued them. But as the hours ticked by and the patrol car remained parked on the edge of the Prescott property, unease began to spread like a sickness. By evening, Deputy Marla Grayson, a young woman with little experience and even less desire to step into Callaway's shoes, decided to investigate. She took two of the town's braver men with her, a farmer and a mechanic, and together they approached the trailer that sat like a tumor on the edge of the burned-out Prescott lot. The scene inside the trailer became the kind of story the town would whisper about for decades, long after the details were blurred by time and retellings. The floor was sticky with blood, a thick, congealed pool that seemed to spread endlessly beneath their boots. On the walls, the macabre map of Miller's Hollow still hung, its red strings looping and tangling around the faces of the dead. At the center of the room lay Sheriff Callaway. His body was sprawled awkwardly on the floor, his eyes wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. His gun was still holstered, untouched, but in his hand he clutched a piece of paper. Scrawled across it in shaky, uneven handwriting were the words, "It was all for them." Of Abby, there was no sign. Her bed was made, her few possessions neatly arranged, but she was gone. The back door of the trailer was open, swinging lazily on its hinges as though she had left only moments before. The deputy and the two men searched the property, but the woods were vast, and night had fallen by the time they realized she wasn't going to be found. It was as though she had vanished into thin air, leaving only death and chaos in her wake. Deputy Grayson called in state police the next morning, and for a brief moment Miller's Hollow became the center of attention for the outside world. News vans rolled into town, their reporters eager to spin the story of the Hollow Killer, a nameless shadow that had terrorized the community. Theories ran wild. Some believed Abby had fled to another state, while others were convinced she had drowned herself in the creek, unable to face the weight of her crimes. But there were darker rumors too. Some said she hadn't run at all, that she was still in the woods, watching, waiting for the right time to strike again. The state police investigation turned up little. The poison used in the killings was identified, but its source remained a mystery. None of the fingerprints in the trailer matched any known offenders, and the piece of paper in Callaway's hand only deepened the mystery. The phrase, "it was all for them," left investigators baffled. Who were they? The victims? The town itself? Or something else entirely? Forensics teams scoured the woods, dredging the creek and searching every abandoned building within miles of the Prescott property. But Abby was nowhere to be found. After 3 months, the case was officially closed. Abby Prescott was declared a fugitive, wanted in connection with multiple homicides, though the evidence against her remained circumstantial at best. Posters with her face were distributed to neighboring states, but the trail went cold, and eventually, the world moved on. Miller's Hollow, however, was never the same. The deaths had left scars on the town, wounds that refused to heal. People no longer gathered at the diner or lingered on their porches in the evening. The sense of community that had once defined the town was gone. replaced by suspicion and fear. The Prescott property became a place of dread, its charred ruins a stark reminder of everything they had lost. No one dared go near it, not even to tear down the trailer or clear the land. It stood as a monument to the darkness that had consumed them, a silent warning to anyone who might think the world was a safe place. But there were still those who believed the story wasn't over. They claimed to see shadows moving in the woods at night, to hear faint laughter carried on the wind. Children whispered about the ghost of Abby Prescott, a pale girl with hollow eyes who wandered the forest, luring the unwary to their deaths. The stories grew more elaborate with each telling. Some said she was a witch, others a demon, and a few insisted she was a vengeful spirit, trapped in the town she had tried to cleanse. Whatever the truth, Miller's Hollow became a place people avoided, a town where every creak of a door and every snap of a twig felt like a reminder of what had happened there. Years passed, and the world forgot about Abby Prescott. The news moved on to fresher horrors, and the posters with her face faded and crumbled on bulletin boards. But the people of Miller's Hollow never forgot. They carried the weight of her actions in their hearts, a collective trauma that bound them together even as it tore them apart. Some left, unable to bear the memories, while others stayed, clinging to the hope that time might eventually erase the stains she had left behind. But deep in the woods, there were signs that time had done nothing to erase Abby's presence. Occasionally, hunters would stumble across strange symbols carved into trees, or piles of bones arranged in intricate patterns on the forest floor. Once, a local teenager claimed to have found an old notebook half buried in the dirt, its pages filled with detailed sketches of the town and its people, each marked with a red X. The boy didn't tell anyone about it until years later, and by then he had already burned it, too afraid of what it might mean. And then there were the disappearances. They were rare, spread out over years, but they always seemed to follow the same pattern. A hiker would go missing, or a drifter passing through town would vanish without a trace. No bodies were ever found, no evidence uncovered, but the people of Miller's Hollow knew better than to dismiss it as coincidence. They would lock their doors and say their prayers, hoping that the darkness would pass them by. But deep down, they all knew the truth. Abby Prescott was still out there, somewhere, waiting, watching, and Miller's Hollow would never be free of her shadow.